In May 2020, the University of California, UCLA, became the first UC campus to establish the Filipino Studies minor. However, we would be remiss to treat this approval of the Filipino Studies minor as a singular moment. And instead, it is important to lift up the longstanding history of campus activism, and specifically student activism that built and sustained the movement over time, starting in the 1970s. The Filipinx campus community in all of its forms, through its students, faculty, and staff, as well as its alums, worked to transform UCLA on their own terms. Together with my co-authors and co-conspirators, Natalie Bacaporo from San Diego State University and Ruben De Leon from UCLA, we begin to historicize this movement and add the Campaign for Filipino Studies, or CPS, as an example of historical and contemporary efforts of communities of color committing to anti-racism and ethnic studies. The following questions guide our inquiry. Number 1, what strategies did community members involved with CPS use to advocate for Filipino studies? Number 2, how was CPS sustained across generations? To answer these questions, we employ content and document analysis of secondary data, specifically archived records, which included event flyers, news and opinion articles, program schedules, social media posts, and the transcriptions of 10 oral histories of alumni and staff from the 1970s to 2010s. All of these texts were made available by UCLA Samahang Filipino Digital Archive, UCLA Asian American Studies Center, and the Daily Bruin student newspaper. We reviewed this secondary data while paying attention to content and overarching themes. So things like who was involved at each point and the overarching local, national, or international context. Our project exists within the intersections of ethnic studies, higher education, and critical race studies. And because of that, we draw from theories in these fields to guide this inquiry. Specifically, our work is informed by the framework of critical race history, or CRH, as forwarded by Aguilar Hernandez, which builds from critical race theory, or CRT. So critical race history provides the integral role of setting the foundation for resistance to racism in the college and university space, uplifting methods such as storytelling and illuminating the transformative power of social movements. And specific to this case, CRH challenges ahistoricism within the university, because collecting, honoring, and analyzing the rich histories of student activists serves as resistance to the systemic erasure of their efforts. And it gives our project the opportunity to not just lift up their voices of intergenerational activism, but we can also use this to critique UCLA's complicated legacy with supporting student movements. So what do we find? What we mainly find can be summarized succinctly as the account of CPS aligns with critical race history's tenet of challenging ahistoricism. Because what we find is that the snapshots captured through these archived materials represent more than just mere moments in a movement. It is a community-rooted, community-built, and community-driven effort that really builds and sustains each other. And the documents reveal how each decade had a unique central focus. So in the genesis of CPS, in the 1970s and 1980s, it really resulted from energy from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the newly established Asian American Studies Center, and even the creation of the Samahang Filipino Student Organization, which really became where students became so involved and future leaders to sustain the rest of this timeline. In the decade of connections and parallels in the 80s and 90s, it really spoke to the influence and intersection of broader concurrent social movements, such as anti-apartheid and affirmative action. And at this point, student leaders really pushed for collaboration with an institutionalization of Filipino faculty, staff, coursework, and programming. In community retention in the 90s to 2000s, the community pursued retention of CPS and the retention of its students. In PAVE, into 2000s to 2010s, it really symbolized a new peak in the start of the institutionalization of the Filipino Studies minor. And finally, in the inauguration and in the later years, and that brings us to present day, CPS was picked up again and finally brought to the time of institutionalization and approval in May 2020. So overall, through this work, as we began to review the decades worth of archived materials recounting CPS, we are part of this work to keep into memory and to bring into memory these collective histories of all those who were involved. And really underlines how documenting institutional knowledge is essential, how this emphasizes the power of community connection and collaboration, and finally, how this work testifies to how the present is truly a result of intergenerational contribution to expanding visions of the future.